Hello, hello. So today I'm going to be covering most of the AP European History course, which is a course in the US that covers roughly the 15th century to the current day. And so by the end of this video, you'll have a general sense of how the course of European history kind of happened from early modernity to the present day. So you won't get a lot of details here, but it's just an overall kind of summary. But I think that's useful in its own way. Cool, so let's just get started. So each century will have its own theme, and as a reminder, 15th century means 1400s, right? So 15th century does not mean 1500s, 15th century means 1400s. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go. 15th century, the big word here is Renaissance, okay? Renaissance. So this is kind of the era where Europe rediscovers its classical roots, right? So classical Greek and Roman roots. After 1,000 years of being dominated by kind of Christian and Catholic dogma, right? So for the past 1,000 years, also called the Middle Ages, Europe has kind of gone from a classical Greek and Roman civilization to a much more feudal civilization that is entirely dependent on Christian and Catholic dogma, right? So the Pope and the Catholic Church kind of determine everything, and you can only make religious art, and there are very strict rules around everything, right? And so the Catholic Church kind of just dominates life, and so one pattern you'll see is that over time, the kind of the pattern of European history is that central authorities are often challenged, and dogmas kind of break apart over time. So the Renaissance is an example of that. So the Renaissance, you might have heard of figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, people like that. And so these kinds of polymaths and artists began to be kind of treated with a lot of respect for the first time in a very long time. And there were these patrons, right? So these very rich people, both the Pope himself and a lot of like the kind of the city-state lords around Italy at first, but then later around all of Europe, began to pay for these artists to kind of work on these projects for a very long time, right? So Michelangelo's David, the Sistine Chapel, the Mona Lisa, a lot of these paintings and artists and kind of like cultural movements happened around this time as a kind of conscious revival movement to reassert the Greco-Roman roots of Europe at the time. Cool. Okay. So that's the Renaissance. And so you can kind of start to see the authority of the Catholic Church kind of starting to both increase in a way because they're patronizing a lot of these artists, but also kind of start to be questioned, right? Because it's not just Christian art anymore. We can also make humanistic art that expresses humans in a very kind of naturalistic way instead of just Bible stories. So speaking of rebellion against the Catholic Church, the 16th century. The big word here is Reformation, okay? Reformation. So, the Catholic Church builds a lot of stuff around this time, including big churches and chapels, as they would. And so they start selling a lot of stuff to the general public, including these things called indulgences, right? So indulgences are basically go to heaven free cards, right? So let's say someone you love just died, and you want them to go to heaven. Then the idea was that the Catholic Church would sell you a piece of paper called an indulgence, and they will basically pray for you, pray for your loved one to go to heaven, or for you to go to heaven when you die. Right, so it's kind of insurance against going to hell. And obviously, this ruffled a lot of feathers, and it wasn't very popular for a lot of reasons, including this guy named Martin Luther. Right, so Martin Luther was a kind of Catholic clergyman, but he was very against this whole idea, and so he posts what is called the 95 Theses, were basically 95 reasons why this whole Catholic Church thing probably isn't the best idea. And so he posts that, and that starts the Protestant Reformation, right? So now there are two kinds of Christians in on the European continent. There are Catholics and there are Protestants, right? So Protestant, literally Protestant, right? They are protesting against the Catholic Church. Cool. Okay, so there are Catholics and there are Protestants, and so the 16th century, as mentioned, is just a century of like a lot of religious violence and conflict. So almost every country in Europe has some kind of civil war in the century between Catholics and Protestants, right? So there's the French Wars of Religion. There's a lot of havoc in England with Queen Elizabeth and her sister Queen Mary, right? So one Protestant, one Catholic. This is also when Henry VIII breaks away from the Catholic Church and forms his own Protestant church, right? So just a lot of just religious turmoil, and so a lot of figures from this time, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli from Switzerland, a lot of these religious reformers are starting to kind of make their own versions of Christianity and not cling so hard to kind of Catholic dogma. But again, the main point here is Reformation and also just a lot of religious violence. Cool. Okay, and then let's move on to the 17th century. So the 17th century, the big word here is scientific revolution, right? Scientific revolution. So before we get into that, at the beginning of the 17th century, there's a very important war called the 30 Years' War. By the 30 Years' War, which at first seems like a continuation of the religious wars, right? So there are Catholic countries and Protestant countries and so forth. And so they start off that way, right? One side is Catholic, one side is Protestant, but then eventually other countries start joining in that are not neatly kind of categorized in those ways, right? So some Catholic countries join the Protestant side, right, because they don't like the other countries on their side and so forth, right? So just a lot of kind of like mixing up of like alliances and things like that. And basically people realize that there's no real point in fighting over these religious conflicts because at the end of the day, everybody's out for themselves. And like the pretense of we are fighting for the correct version of Christianity has kind of faded by this point. So that's why the 17th century, as previously mentioned, the big idea is scientific revolution. Okay, scientific revolution. So this is when a lot of the major scientific advances in Europe happen. So think of Newton, think of Francis Bacon, think of not quite Copernicus and Galileo because they were a little bit earlier, but basically around this time is where a lot of the fundamentals of modern mathematics and physics and astronomy were kind of established. And so Newton is the representative figure of the 17th century. He obviously writes the Principia, which is a kind of monumental like piece of mathematics that people still reference to this day, amazingly. There's also, everybody knows Newton for gravity, right? So the law of universal gravitation, everybody kind of hears that story in school, but obviously if you take physics in high school, right, then you'll also learn that Newton basically pioneered the three fundamental laws of motion, right? So which kind of establishes the very basics of modern physics, and also he invents calculus, right? So if you've taken calculus in high school, then you'll know that Newton invents calculus essentially almost from scratch, and while doing astronomy work. I believe, right, to calculate like the shape and speed of the orbits of the planets, which is kind of amazing. So there are a lot of debates around this, but many people think that Newton is the greatest scientist of all time. All right, so there are a lot of debates whether it's Newton or Einstein, maybe Hawking, but a lot of people think that Sir Isaac Newton is certainly the representative figure of the 17th century, and also just one of the goats of mathematics in general. Cool, okay, so that is the 17th century, so let's move on to the 18th century. So the 18th century, the big word here is enlightenment, okay? Enlightenment. So, as mentioned, there is a pattern here. So the Reformation was a questioning of Catholic dogmas around religion, right? And then after that, the Scientific Revolution was basically a reformation around questioning Catholic dogmas around science, right? So before that, the Catholic Church controlled science, but the Scientific Revolution is saying, hey, now, we have the scientific method, and so we need to actually test things and see if the results line up. And if they line up, then we will say that this is true. The Enlightenment is a continuation of that pattern, but applied to society, right? So a lot of people phrase the Enlightenment as basically the scientific revolution, but instead of the natural world, it is applied to the kind of the social sciences and the social world. So a lot of Enlightenment figures that you might have heard of, a lot of them, René Descartes, the famous French Enlightenment philosopher, he is famous for his saying, I think, therefore I am, which is kind of a very representative phrase for the Enlightenment. John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations, right? So just a lot of like social sciences and a lot of kind of humanities start to kind of really come into their own because people start to question, hey, why are so many kind of social norms the way they are, right? Up until now, nobody's really questioned them because they served everyone just kind of okay. But now they're really starting to question why certain things are the way they are. And David Hume is another big one. But there are a lot of pieces around this time around government, right? So like forms of government, the ideal form of government, why a ruler should rule, and things like that, right? So John Stuart Mill writes a very famous piece called On Liberty, which basically outlines how he thinks that liberty is kind of a fundamental right of human beings. Thomas Hobbes writes The Leviathan, which essentially states that he thinks that the natural state of the world, or humans in general, is very just violent. Right. So the phrase he uses is life is naturally nasty, brutish, and short. Right. And so the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. And so you need a giant kind of overwhelming government called the Leviathan to suppress all of that. And so he's basically arguing for a kind of form of kind of patriarchal form of government where the government kind of takes care of you in a lot of ways. Patriarchal might not be the right term, but the government kind of is supposed to take care of society because society cannot take care of itself. Cool. And then John Stuart Mill also writes Two Treatises of Government. One second. Or is that John Locke? Oh, that's John Locke. So John Locke writes Two Treatises of Government, which is kind of the opposite view, where he basically says that the role of government is to kind of maximize personal liberty. And so you won't be surprised to learn that this century, the 18th century, is also when the two great revolutions happen. The French Revolution and the American Revolution on the other side of the pond. And so you can kind of see the ideological underpinnings behind both those revolutions, right? So they both overthrew a king, and so they're both kind of questioning, hey, why are things the way they are? They don't really need to be this way, so why are things the way they are? And so, yes, that's kind of when theory gets taken into practice. And so overall, most people say that when you look at the 18th century, then the overall theme is that it's a very liberalizing time. Right? It's a very liberalizing time, and so the Enlightenment, it's an era almost similar to kind of ancient Greece in a lot of ways, right? There are all these great thinkers, they all have these kind of great ideas, and they all have their own ideas about how society should be structured, the nature of humanity, and things like that. Okay, so now let's move on to the 19th century. Okay, so the 19th century is the opposite in a lot of ways. It is a kind of very reactionary time. So the 19th century, if I had to summarize it in a kind of a phrase or phrases, it would be nationalism and imperialism, right? So whereas the previous 18th century were about enlightenment and liberalism, this century is kind of dominated by very reactionary and nationalistic figures. So the 19th century begins with Napoleon, right? So the pure chaos caused by the French Revolution, right? So the French Revolution was originally started to overthrow the king, but over time there was so much chaos and so much kind of back and forth between different factions and so forth that people just became really sick of all political talk and also just a sheer amount of violence that they saw in the streets. And so when Napoleon came along, amazingly, the same French people that had risen up to overthrow the king now supported Napoleon as emperor, and so that was his actual title. It was the Emperor of the French, and so now France has an emperor, and the next 30 years or so are dominated by the Napoleonic Wars, which are basically Napoleon versus everybody in Europe. And for a while, Napoleon wins. For a very, very long time. Sorry, not 30 years, 15 years. Yeah, 15 years. But yeah, so for around 15 years, Napoleon kind of steamrolls through Europe, and he spreads revolutionary values in a lot of places. But he's also literally an emperor. But then he's eventually defeated by the seventh or eighth coalition of everybody else in Europe, and he is exiled. So afterwards, there's this guy named Metternich, right? Clemens von Metternich. He's a German guy or Prussian guy, since Germany doesn't exist yet. Metternich establishes what is called the Concert of Europe, right? So concert, not like a musical concert, but Concert of Europe basically means the balance of powers of all the European kind of countries, right? So basically, he's saying that rather than risk having Napoleon that kind of sweeps throughout Europe again, each European country should kind of have its own sphere of influence and should kind of form its alliances in like certain ways so that that the balance of power never shifts. And so this is an era of intense kind of competition between European countries and also a lot of nation building, right? And also the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is not a minor point, so I should have emphasized it more. But the Industrial Revolution, obviously, major technological changes. The steam engine, steam-powered boats, more advanced weaponry. The airplane is a little bit later, but kind of early forms of new weaponry. The Gatling gun, which proves to be huge, and so it's kind of the development of like modern industrial society happens around this time. And so this is an era where there is not a lot of direct fighting between European countries in Europe, surprisingly, for the most part. But each country is kind of building up its industry, its factories, its kind of like national strength, and they're competing around the world, right, in acquiring colonies, right? So this is the era of new imperialism, right? New imperialism meaning that they're going to Africa, they're going to Asia, and so a lot of kind of the colonialism that we know today, right? So the scramble for Africa, where almost every single major European country goes to Africa and like slices out a piece for itself. The Opium Wars, where they invade China, and basically when Europe essentially takes over the world is around this time. But obviously, this kind of situation provides for a very kind of fertile ground for conflict eventually, right? So so as previously mentioned, the Industrial Revolution kind of just happened, and no one has really kind of tested out what all these weapons can do to each other. The American Civil War is a very brief peek into that. But again, Europe is just kind of loaded with all these weapons and all these kinds of like nationalistic sentiments. And France and Germany hate each other. And by the way, Germany exists now as a single country, which they haven't done for all this time. A lot of that is just kind of like piling up in such a way that war is kind of inevitable. And so let's move on to the 20th century. Okay, the 20th century, I think if I had to summarize it, although it's not that long ago, the 20th century is the century of ideology. Okay, ideology. As previously mentioned, the powder keg that is Europe at around this time culminates in what is called World War I, which you might have heard of, where so many people die that afterwards people start to write all these poems and books about how all war is bad, and they blame the whole thing on Germany. But Germany gets very mad, and so as you probably know, that leads to World War II with Hitler and the Nazis. Also Japan on the other side, but this is an AP European history course, so I won't cover Japan too much. So essentially, just a lot of that is happening. So World War II. I won't go over World War II too much because there are a billion World War II videos on YouTube. But the reason I said that the 20th century is a century of ideology is because of World War I and World War II, and also the following Cold War between the US and the USSR. And this is where most AP European history courses kind of end, because after this, Europe kind of ceases to be the driver in like global politics. Right, so up until now, like from the Renaissance really up until World War II, Europe has really been like the place where the most exciting stuff are happening. But after this point, after this point, they're kind of the main power kind of foci switch from Europe to number one the U.S. And then to the east to the USSR, and then eventually to China and kind of East Asia these days. Cool. And so obviously the Cold War, very briefly, Europe is split into two parts by the Iron Curtain in the middle, right? So there's the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc. They kind of compete for a while. But then in 1991, communism falls, and most of the countries that were formerly communist, they jump over to the capitalist bloc, and so that's where kind of the foundations of modern Europe kind of come in with an enlarged European Union. European Union. I should mention that. So the European Union has its roots in a lot of kind of like trading agreements that were made between France and Germany in the 1950s. But then over time, they start to do more stuff with each other, and they also start to add more members, right? So I believe the official incorporating treaty of the EU was was the early 1990s, 91, I believe, Maastricht. But this kind of movement has been happening for a very long time, ever since World War II, basically resolving that the major European countries should not fight again, because like the world has seen how devastating a major European war is. And so the European Union has been a pretty successful product so far in that sense. They haven't had any wars between their member states. And so that's kind of the status quo that was carried through until the end of the 20th century. Cool, and then obviously it's too early to say anything about the 21st century, but we'll see how it goes. But anyway, that was my brief, not very brief, summary of AP European history. And so I hope this helps somebody either in class or if you're just watching this while working or something like that. I hope it provided some kind of entertainment. But yeah, cool. So I'll see you guys in the next one.